Hello and welcome to Igalia Chats. I'm Eric Meyer. I'm a developer advocate at Igalia.
I am Brian Kardell. I am also a developer advocate at Igalia. And today we're joined by Rick Byers. Hi, Rick.
Hi, guys. I'm Rick. I'm a longtime engineer on the Chrome team.
And also you have a distinction of being our most invited guest. This is, I think, your fourth visit. So
That's awesome.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I'm very honored.
You're always a good guest.
One more and you get a free guest appearance.
Free Igalia tote bag.
Awesome.
So I don't know if you recall a few episodes ago, Eric, we had this mail-in episode and Kent Dodds asked if you could break any web feature, which one would it be?
Yeah, and we talked about that, and I took the position that you should never break a web feature, basically. I continue to make, but I'm sure in that discussion made a big deal out of the web should be compatible both forwards and backwards in time. I should be able to load up the very first web page, which I can, and the very first web browser should be able to load up pages that are made today and at least get something. So, and then you afterward pointed out to me, there's this list of like 100 things that Chrome has unshipped. It has
over 200.
Over 200. A triple digit number of things that have been broken. Broken, I'm going to put in air quotes here, because hopefully we can get more details from Rick, but not all of them were necessarily broken per se. But they were unshipped. They had been shipped, and then they were removed, so they were unshipped. So, Rick, what does unshipping mean exactly from your perspective?
Yeah, I would say there's a continuum, and we tend to think about it as breaking changes, right? So unshipping is one type of breaking change, but it tends to be a lot more nuanced than that. I mean, it can be everything from, hey, we unshipped Flash. That was a huge breaking change, to sometimes we make little tiny bug fixes that we don't even necessarily consider a breaking change, but they change the behavior of the engine in some way that causes a significant breakage for users, right? I mean, in extreme cases, sometimes in past lives, I've worked on platforms where we just sped something up. When I was at Microsoft, we made an improvement to .NET where we just improved performance, and it exposed a latent race condition that meant a whole bunch of executives could no longer read their email due to a bug, right? And that's like technically a breaking change, but there's a big continuum there. And so we try to draw a line in the Chromium process where we say, breaking changes that are expected to have some impact or reasonably predicted to have some impact on web developers are something we need to go through a pretty careful process to evaluate and consider the trade-offs around.
And how do you evaluate that sort of thing?
Yeah, it's tricky. We've developed a pattern. So there's this document that I think started a bunch of this conversation that I wrote many years ago called the Blank Principles of Web Compatibility. And we try to just list out a bunch of different properties that we look for when evaluating both the risk and the benefit of a breaking change. So the first big class of properties is just minimizing the end user impact. And we go through all sorts of signals we use to try to evaluate what's the end user impact of this change. So the simplest one is in Chromium, for Chrome in particular, we have these use counters that just say what fraction of page loads is triggering this behavior. So that's the first heuristic we use. And you might be surprised, when if we see this behavior is used on 0.001% of page loads, we say, oh crap, that's a lot. That's scary, because
right.
Even if it's just 0.001%, that's still potentially somebody being broken like every few minutes or something in the world just because so many web pages are loaded.
Okay, yeah.
Like
I don't know what 0.001% is like. How many is that? Millions of pages, hundreds of thousands of pages?
I think I wrote in this document. I mean, let's see. I wrote this document back in 2017, but I wrote here that around 770 billion web pages are viewed in Chrome every month. So you can multiply 770 billion by 0.001%, right? But it's tens of millions at least of web pages every month. So that's the first general category is we try to evaluate the impact on the users. But that's just, it's really common to over-index on that one number because it's a simple, easy number to get, but it often doesn't tell the whole story. sometimes there's one great example where we had a bunch of these legacy constants on the event object. I think there was some quirk in WebKit, they were never standardized. And somebody said, what are these? Like, these seem useless. Why is anybody using these for anything? And our use counter said they were used all over the place. And we went and found some examples of where they were used. And it was just generic code that said, for all properties on event, copy into this log object or something like that, right? And so we said, oh, just because the property is red doesn't mean it's actually being used, right? So that was an example where we had to decide our use counters were basically useless. And instead, we did some other analysis, and we tried to do some searching of the HTTP archive to say, when we see these properties used, are they always used in this silly pattern that's just kind of copying them from one place to another? Do we see the actual property names in JavaScript anywhere? And that was one where we decided we didn't have a lot of data on end user breakage, but we had this intuition that this really shouldn't be impacting any websites. And that was one where we took the risk to just delete these and be prepared to respond, delete them and then see what happens with our beta channel users, for example. And that was one where the other anecdotal evidence we had that is often really useful is we asked people from Firefox, for example, hey, Firefox doesn't have these. Do you have any bugs in Firefox due to websites not having this API, right? And in that, I think in that case, there was no evidence of there ever being a site compat issue due to these APIs. So we decided that was enough evidence to take the risk of trying to remove them. And sure enough, we deleted them and we never heard a single complaint. So that was a success despite a very high use counter.
Okay.
But there's a whole other set of other properties, right? You asked, and then we could dive into any of these, but I said there's minimizing end user impact, and there's various ways we try to evaluate that. There's maximizing the user experience. So this is where we get to security and privacy. If we're improving security and privacy in some ways, then that kind of tilts the scale in terms of benefit. There's performance. Sometimes we make breaking changes because we make pages load a lot faster, and that can be contentious. There's one great example where there was this intervention only for users on 2G networks, where we found that if we just refused to load third-party scripts using blocking document.write on really slow networks, yes, that was a breaking change, but it meant that we had 25% more page loads that actually finished. So what that told us was things were so slow in those cases that users were giving up on the web page. Well, in some sense, we were trading one type of breakage for another type. We made those web pages a lot faster such that users could use them. But we made a breaking change based on performance, which is arguably debatable. And then there's other categories as well. Big one is minimizing web developer impact. We want to go through a lot of effort to say, if we're going to make a breaking change, there's a responsibility on us to try to minimize the chance that web developers are going to be negatively impacted by this, whether it's outreach or giving developers an easy way to adapt to it. And then there's a whole other category for maximizing web ecosystem health. And there's the benefit for the ecosystem. And that includes, are we going to improve interoperability, things like that.
It's funny you mentioned the one where there's just a bunch of consts, because there's two parts of that are I think interesting to me. So one is you need data, right? I mean, you could just be well, I don't know, it doesn't seem like it's probably a thing that people use, and let's turn it off and see what happens. That seems like not a great idea, so you want to gain some confidence in what you think about it, but basically the HTTP archive and Chrome's own use counter are, I think, the biggest source of data for that, right?
I think so. Increasingly now, we use another type of data that's similar to our use counter. Our use counter is very coarse, right? It just tells us what fraction of page loads is this used on. We have a feature in Chrome for users who have opted in to anonymous aggregated data collection. We have a feature that we call UKM, URL keyed metrics. And that's one where, in addition to getting a bit of whether it's used, we can get the URL on which it was used. And so we can do some more sophisticated analysis based on that and say, well, what's the distribution across? Is this a feature that's used on one popular website, in which case it's probably easier to break? Or is it a feature that's used on 50% of the top million except for the top 100, right? It's very tail weighted, right? And those are almost impossible to break because there's hundreds of thousands of developers who would have to make a change in that case.
Yeah, I was gonna say, so I only in maybe 2018 or something like that, I started, I guess it was a little bit more than like 2017, but I started getting involved in some things with the HP archive and looking at that data and, you know, kind of interrogating some of these things myself. And it is surprisingly full of complex twists like that. Like I know I wanted to know about closed shadow DOM, because I've always said, like, I think that almost nobody really wants that, in my opinion. Like it doesn't intuit to me that that's what you would want. I get why we got it. I was, you know, I know where it came from and everything, but I think that ultimately people want a speed bump. They want a sign, not a cop kind of thing. Something to prevent friendly fire. Anyway, I said, well, it's been shipped for a long time. Let's see what's the usage. And it was like just as high for closed shadow DOM. And I said, that's amazing. Like, who's using it? And like, I went and with Barry Pollard at HP Archive, you know, we went through and dug through some URLs, and what we found was a lot of stuff like that, where it was just like iterating through properties and trying to do like some kind of like fingerprinting, or, you know, like, how can I determine that you're this browser I need to load this shim for, or whatever. So it's tricky. Like, how do you make that interpretation with that data? Or we had another thing where we were writing the markup chapter, and we found this like 64 character long, same weird like typo that caused a tag name to be like 64 characters long of weird escape characters. And it's like, you know that didn't occur on 10,000 pages independently, right? That's common cause, but it looks like a really popular thing because it's just like the same system showing it on 10,000 pages. So getting at that data and making sense of it is really complicated. So
It is,
do you think that does it worry you? Like, do you have other ideas about how, I guess you just kind of told us one, you know, like other ideas of how we can gain more confidence?
There's a lot of things. I mean, I do, there's some amount of trial and error, and there's some amount of judgment here, but I do think as a whole, we've come a long way. I think we've learned a lot about how to do these things in a responsible manner. And the reason you're surprised to hear that there's 200 or something is because almost all of them go off without a hitch, right? You know, you've probably seen a couple press stories about some that didn't go off without a hitch. And we, you know, if you read this document, a lot of it is about trying to take a really honest accounting and learning from our mistakes so that we can get better and better over time. And so, for example, one of the things we've learned is we used to rely really heavily on our beta channels and say, you know, well, let's try this and see if people file bugs in beta. And that's useful. Like, it actually is meaningful. But there's just the type of user who installs a beta version of browser is not representative of the users who install all browsers, right? We tend to undermiss enterprise, for example, in beta, right? And so, well, we still get some value from that. I would argue we've learned over the years now, Chrome relies much more on what we call early stable, where we upgrade, when we're ready to push out a new version of our browser, we upgrade, say, 1% of our users, you know, a week ahead of everybody else. And we look at metrics and we look for bug reports during that period. And then in addition, we make sure, we know there's always going to be mistakes, right? It's a fallacy, it's a trap to think that you can ever be perfect at this kind of risk analysis. And what you need instead is to engineer a really good feedback loop. Having a really good feedback loop is more important than trying to do a perfect job of prediction. And so, for example, this means that we need to have a bug reporting, triage, routing, and diagnostics pipeline that we can trust, so that when we have a breaking change and someone reports it, we can have confidence that within 24 hours or less, we've detected it. And then we now have a policy, for example, that anytime we're making a change that we think may be breaking, including shipping a new API, we do it under a runtime flag, which means we have the ability to toggle the behavior without shipping a new binary. And so that also gives us some confidence. We can say, oh, we're doing this thing we think is safe, but we're not 100% sure it's safe. And so we're prepared with what we call a kill switch that we can deploy to all Chrome users to reverse the decision on very short notice if we're wrong. And then that gives us, when we have confidence in our feedback system and our ability to react to that feedback, now we can be comfortable taking a little bit more risk. And you know, this is always a balance and it's a trade-off kind of, but I think we've learned a lot over the last 10 years of doing this that generally we can manage the risks pretty well, I think.
A lot of this goes into processes, and a lot of the things have changed over the years. Processes evolve over time. So when I look at this list, I see a lot of features that I don't think would have made it into the system necessarily today because they were from earlier processes. So you have these, cruft that was like introduced in maybe early Firefox, and it was just sort of like copied along, but turns out nobody really used it. So it was like relatively easy to get rid of. Or there was one that was in here that was I like it was added for Apple's dashboard in 2004. It was this composite attribute on image elements. I didn't even know that existed. And in the Google, thing, it had Philip saying, I didn't even know this existed either, and it turns out that nobody else did either. So it was not hard to unship it.
Yep.
But there's I think that a lot of those things maybe would have had some more scrutiny today. Like the blink process is actually pretty involved today. Do you want to can you give us a like quick super high level, like how does something get shipped in Chrome to not 1% but to all of the percent?
The high level is that we try to have a process that balances, that is both maximally transparent and inclusive, right? So we look for signals from all the other browser vendors. We look for signals from the tag. We look for, what's the status of spec maturity. And critically, we added a number of years back, we want to see a high quality conformance test suite before we add features. And so we're kind of looking at that, but also we want to process that. A lot of processes have a tendency to devolve into stop energy, right? And they just, hey, we're trying to mitigate risk. Let's just move slower and slower and slower and slower. And so we've tried to be careful to design a process that promotes velocity and therefore is comfortable with taking some risk and making some mistakes. And so our shipping process and our breaking change process have really evolved hand in hand, because if we had no confidence in our ability to make breaking changes, I think we would need a much, much higher bar. We'd have to ship things a lot slower and have to be a lot more careful in what we ship. And we've learned over time, there's a lot of nuance here. It depends a lot on the shape of the API. For example, we've learned that when you add a new CSS feature, you're probably not going to get adoption until you have it supported across all major browser engines. And then you're probably going to get pretty widespread adoption that's going to be really hard to change. But there's a class of JavaScript features, JavaScript features that are targeting specific big players. For example, we have a feature called FedCM that really targets identity providers. And it turns out that if you're shipping a new JavaScript feature for FedCM, you can expect it's going to be a lot easier to change, because you probably, even if it's used on a lot of websites, it's probably used on a lot of websites via, 5 big IDPs, for example. Payment request isn't the same. There's not that many payment processors, right? Even though they're used on lots of websites. And so one of the things I learned early on, I was surprised by some of the requests for breaking changes to payment request. And I said, this sounds crazy. How are you going to know this is safe? And the answer was, well, because I know the 3 people in the world using this API, and we talk regularly, and they've all told me that they've made the changes necessary to not rely on it anymore. And I said, oh, that I came from a world where I spent more time in CSS, for example, and it's just wildly different types of APIs with wildly different kind of compatibility properties.
Right.
Sorry, I forget what your question was, though. I don't know if I answered it.
No, I was asking you to maybe talk about the process to get something shipped.
Yeah, right. So we're trying to balance. So, tactically, the way the process works is we have this tool called Chrome Status that tries to manage a lot of this process, but ultimately boils down to an email thread, to a public mailing list called intent to ship. Hey, I want to ship this thing. And here's the data we have. Here's the signals we have. What's the spec? What's its level of maturity? What are the conformance test suites? What signals do we have from other browser vendors? Signals do we have from tag? That sort of thing. And then we have a set of API owners. The Chromium project has, I'm not sure what it is right now. Historically, it's somewhere around 12 or so API owners, and 3 of them need to say, this seems like a good trade-off to me. The benefits seem to outweigh the risks of shipping this to me. But key to the process, though, is acknowledging that we're never going to get it perfect, and that we're going to make mistakes, and that we have to be comfortable with correcting, with having a process to correct for mistakes. And so that's what we kind of, the flip side of intent to ship is intent to deprecate and remove, which is really, we probably should have given it a better name, intent to break or something. Anytime you want to make a breaking change, when we're shipping, the primary risk that we're evaluating is interoperability risk. What's the risk that this API is not going to eventually work the same in all browsers? Where for breaking changes, the primary risk that we're evaluating is compatibility risk. What's the risk that this change is going to cause existing websites to behave differently or be broken in some way? And they're kind of, sometimes you have them both at the same time. In fact, shipping any new API can also be a compatibility risk. For example, as part of the reporting API, we shipped window.report at some point, and we did some analysis. We thought it was safe. We didn't account for this big enterprise application that was relying on having an iframe with a name of report, right? So you could say iframe name equals report, and then somewhere in the code they had window.report. And they expected that to give them their iframe. This is some legacy DOM feature that has been discouraged for a long, long time, but still works in all browsers. Yeah. So that was a case where, hey, turns out we just can never ship an API called report because we're going to break this major enterprise application that assumes no such API exists.
That was invented by Brendan Eich way back in the very, very early days because I was complaining about it on Twitter way back, and he was like, yeah, that was me.
Good. Well, I'm glad I know who to blame.
Right, exactly.
Brendan, as usual. I mean, it usually gets back to Brendan when we're talking about DOM stuff.
Right. So yeah, I was asking about the process because I think like it also evolved over time to like try to find ways to prevent things leaking out. Because like it used to be that even we would just ship something, we shipped things with vendor prefixes back in the day, and those worked all over. Like you could have like prefixed IDL, you could, whatever, like you can.
Yeah, but in some ways, prefixes were just a different way of trying to balance this trade-off I'm talking about. Right?
Exactly,
so
right.
Interoperability risk and velocity. And it turned out we were putting blinders on. We were deluding ourselves into thinking that they gave us a sweet spot between interoperability risk and velocity. They just gave us the velocity and just allowed us to ignore the interoperability risk, right?
Exactly. And so I think there are examples of this today where like all of the browsers have to respect some WebKit properties because like they turned out to be just too widely relied upon. And so, the example that I like all the time, it kind of doesn't matter what we write down. What matters is what everybody does. And it's important that we try to write it down so that like everybody who does the implementation gets as close as they can. And then we continue to refine it. But like, I know, there's plenty of things that happen sort of de facto that leaked out there like that. But I think that this process then evolved a little bit. So there's, like you said, there's Canary. We have these things behind a flag. So you have like experimental web platform features you can enable in all of the browsers, right? Like, so, there's steps to prevent it from, the experiment from leaking out before we are confident that it's like at least a pretty good take and that we can slam on the brakes if we need to, right?
Part of the challenge here, I think, has been that we used to assume that confidence came from really careful thinking and like careful debate in standards committees. And certainly that is valuable. But I think, at least I feel like I've learned, I think we've learned as an industry that confidence comes more from actually validating product market fit and actually getting people using something, seeing does it actually solve the problem, what problems does it cause in that practice, or at least you need that as well. It's not enough to just get wide review. You actually need experience. And so to me, the main thing that's helped us find a sweet spot in this trade-off has been origin trials. And that started as a discussion. I think it was Jacob Rossi from the Edge team who first brought this up at a TPAC brainstorming session of like, hey, can't we find a safe way to experiment that gives us what we wanted from prefixes without the downsides? And the history for us has been, so origin trials, if you're not familiar, it's just a way, I think Chrome and Edge, I don't know if there's other browsers that support it, but Chrome and Edge each have a system where a developer can sign up and get a key that's tied to their origin that they can put on their webpage that enables an experimental API for them that they can use in public. But in order to get that key, they have to click on a thing that says, I understand this is an experiment that's time limited and it will stop working. It will break at some point. And they also have to supply an email address so that they can be notified of what the breaks are going to be and when they are. And we started very conservatively with the design of origin trials. We were very afraid of just reintroducing prefixes. And I think what we've learned is now we've done hundreds and hundreds of origin trials, and I'm not aware of a single example where we've felt boxed in by something, where we've actually, where origin trials have failed to prevent the interoperability risk. And so we've slowly gotten a bit more lax. We used to require a gap at the end of an origin trial before shipping a feature. So we thought, promising that there'd be a period where the API didn't work was important to preserve the safety. Turns out we eliminated that. We haven't seen any downside to that. So that was a place we've been able to just move a little bit more in the direction of velocity and not seen. But it's something we've had to learn and figure out, I think. And I imagine we will see, some examples of it not working perfectly that we'll want to use to push us back in the other direction over time as well.
So is there anything special you have to do to be an origin?
No, so origin trials are designed. One of the properties we wanted was to make sure that all websites were treated equal, right? So you have to have to have TLS. So I don't consider having HTTPS something special anymore. That's table stakes. But maybe for some people they still consider that a burden. I don't know, because we can't trust what the origin is if you don't have TLS. But once you have a TLS connection with a cert, then you can just sign up and say, hey, I want. And in fact, anyone can go and get a key for any origin. You can go and get an origin trial key for google.com if you want. It's just not going to be very useful to you unless you actually have the ability to put it on a page served from google.com. Because then the idea is the browser just uses the key, checks to make sure it's signed by the right private key, and then checks to make sure the origin matches the origin of the website.
Like if I have my own website, I could get an origin key, put it on there, and then that would cause anyone who's loading my site to essentially participate in the origin trial?
Yep, exactly.
Okay.
Yep. Fun. So it still means for us to put something in origin trial, we still have to go through like security and privacy reviews if we're launching it, right? It has as much risk on that side. We don't have to be quite as worried about the state of the standard. We can let people experiment with something in production and learn about, what works, what doesn't work. And then we can feed that back into the standards process and make breaking changes to the API before we really, say, hey, this is a mature, specification that we think is at the level to ship.
Okay, so that's a breaking change, as in we're going to change the stuff that's being origin trialed, right? Like,
yep.
CSS anchor positioning is probably a recent example of this, where the anchor positioning specification has gone through changes, right? As people have tried things out, as it's been discussed, the original anchor positioning specification is not exactly what the specification says now. But so there are breaking changes in there where, we discovered that this particular combination of properties and or values doesn't work out right. We had to adjust it. That is a quote unquote breaking change, but it hasn't really shipped publicly yet. So
yeah, exactly. We generally, when we say breaking change, normally we mean a change to something that's already publicly shipped. So if it's just behind a flag, it's just experimental web platform features, or it's just origin trial, it's expected that those things are going to change. And okay, so, yep. Maybe it's going to break some website somewhere, but that's on the site at that point. It's not on the browser. So there's no approval. There's no policy required really for making a change to an API that hasn't gone through our intent to ship process yet.
Okay. Yeah, that's very cool. So anyone listening to this could basically opt to their own site into an origin trial, and then,
it's how we learn. Like a lot of design has been done. I think select menu is done this way as well, right? There's a lot of design where, especially for more complex features, where it's really hard to know how exactly to balance some of the trade-offs of the design. I think we were able to do design much better by, in some sense, having the implementation and one or two real-world deployments proceeding in parallel, right? And kind of feeding off each other, learning from each other. And only then do we get to the point where we say, oh, now we really understand how this thing works. We usually don't even write a spec by that point, right? We have an explainer. We require an explainer for an origin trial, but we don't require a spec. But then we make sure origin trials are time limited, right? We don't want things to stay in that state. So, eventually, if you're running an origin trial, you have to request, I think you get to run it for up to 6 months. And then you can request 3 months extensions one at a time, but you have to show the progress on standards and what you've learned, how you've evolved the standard. And we have had cases where API owners have said, sorry, we're not extending your origin trial because you're not making progress towards shipping this as a proper specification. So it's just not going to be available anymore.
Interesting.
Yeah, there's all sorts of things that could go wrong here, I'm sure. But in practice, it's worked surprisingly well. In fact, I've been surprised at how we've been able to get more and more value out of it, and without having some of the negative side effects that we were worried about.
But looking at the list of things, like there was like multiple shadow roots. I know it's interesting to look at some of these things and say like, well, I don't know, like, was it the right was it the right mix, right? Like, did we let it escape too early? But like multiple shadow roots, I don't think there were no origin trials. Like, we could not have put them in origin trials. That was too early. In fact, that work might have begun before the split even, right? The work on...
Yeah, I think it did. Yeah, I remember Dmitry Glaskov and others were landing patches in WebKit.
Right.
I don't know.
There were a couple of things in this list of things that were unshipped that were interesting to me because they were like shipped, and then they were like, it's actually the implementation is not very good, so we have to unship it. And then later on they were reshipped. Yeah. So like one was CSS variables was there was an initial implementation that was, I guess the implementation was not very good, and it was unshipped both, like it was in the fork and it was unshipped from Blink and also from WebKit. When WebKit saw that you were unshipping it, they looked at it, and actually Andreas Kling, who was on the show and is doing Ladybird, was the one who approved removing it from WebKit too. So that was interesting. And then one that's close to me, MathML, was also a casualty for the same reason. And no, I mean, it is really unfortunate that happened at that point in time. I think we would probably be better off if we had somehow managed to do what we did with MathML ultimately back then. But like, I think MathML will be better off in the end for the fact that we didn't just roll with the what was going on in there, because it did force scrutiny to say, yeah, but how does it align with the platform? Like, how does it how does it work with CSS? Like, why isn't there any IDL for any of these things? So yeah, I mean, I think it can improve things too, even though there's like a temporary and maybe sometimes way too long pause in there. The process though, because the process, you have these steps that are good to watch, and I think of them as kind of like forcing functions. So like if you watch, like there's intent to experiment, right? Like that's one, and that was broken out after, like, I think the toast incident, I would say. I don't know how you want to refer to that, but
I think we introduced intent to experiment. I think we had that from the beginning of origin trials. That's just about getting an approval to run an origin trial. And I think we introduced that as soon as we had. Maybe you're thinking intent to prototype. Maybe
that's the one. Yeah, that's intent.
Yeah. That's where that came later. We didn't have that initially, I think, and that the idea there was to try to make it. We used to call it intent to implement, which caused a lot of confusion. People were like, "What do you mean you're implementing this? This isn't ready to be implemented." And we said, no. All we mean is we're starting to prototype and experiment and learn about what this API is, right? And so intent to prototype is about, we encouraged people to, and it's not required in the process, but it's encouraged to send this email as a heads up saying, hey, we're starting to land code for this, to help front load discussions and raise awareness.
That's interesting though, because it's like a forcing function, right? Like I said, so like when it was called intent to implement, people looked at it with a a new degree of scrutiny. They were like, wait a minute, this is ready to ship. That's what I understand. So I better look at this before it ships, because once it ships, then it's harder, you know? So you got a lot of comments, and it was like, we don't want that kind of comment right now, because we're not really implementing. We're intending to begin prototyping. So you can be involved in that and direct all those comments over there. That would be great, but we're not shipping. Don't misunderstand. And now it's like intent to ship is more like what I think is a forcing function that people can watch. And the reason I say forcing function is that a thing that I've noticed, that part of the reason that we got into this conversation in the first place was like, I watch too many things, you know, and as a result, you know, things in standards frequently take many years. And as a result, occasionally you need to say like, okay, I need to step back away from that one for a while, and then just kind of like check back in when it's serious, like when it's, you know, ready to take its next step or whatever. And seeing something intended to ship, if I see that, it goes, oh, it now is that time, you know. But that's also unfortunate, because it means that there is this time when you, Google, or whoever is the people working on that, like they're trying really hard to work on it, and they're not getting the feedback because like there's not enough people who have the sort of time and budget to look at it critically in the same way. I don't know. It's a difficult balance. Do you think about that internally in the team at all? This sort of like push pull, and where's the risk? Maybe this kill switch idea is like sometimes a really good forcing function, and maybe I'm not encouraging that you should use it, but I'm just saying, like, do you think about it that way sometimes?
Think about the kill switch as a forcing function?
Yeah, like, could you just let a thing go, you know, like, we're going to ship it because we're, you know, we want to make sure that people really paying attention, because we think it's really good, and it's just not getting the feedback, and we don't.
Yeah. So first of all, I think there's often a misunderstanding in terms of feeling like intent to ship is the last chance. And I think we've all learned it's really not, right? Interoperability is an ongoing process. And we've got lots of examples where we've shipped something where we've had trouble getting much engagement outside of the Chrome team, for example, or sometimes it's, you know, other teams working on a feature that, you know, they have a particular reason to care about it, want to push it forward, and just nobody else really seems to have a reason. So it's hard to get people to prioritize, you know, looking at something. And then you ship it and it gets some usage somewhere. And then now it's like a lot more interesting. You know, it's like, oh, now I see it being used on this website, you know? And because one of the reasons I've cared so much about our breaking change process is because I think having some confidence in our breaking change process means that we can have more confidence in saying it's okay that intent to ship is not the last chance to change something, right? To say, like, really what we want to get to is standardization and full interoperability, right? And what's the fastest way to get standardization and full interoperability? I think in some cases, it does mean shipping something in one engine to learn about it. And maybe, like we always said, we want to make it cheap to fail, right? We have some examples. Request autocomplete was one that blew my mind, right? I thought request autocomplete was a great feature. It's like, you know, hey, sites, we know that sites convert faster. You know, people check out more often and complete things on sites when autocomplete is there to like fill in their credit card information for them, for example. And so we added an API that sites could use to help, like, you know, provoke it and make the autofill experience better. And for whatever reason, it just like literally got zero usage, right? And that's one where I'm glad other browsers didn't spend time, you know, debating the spec for this thing, because it turned out to just not, you know, I was going to say not be a good idea. I don't know if it was a bad idea or if it was just a good idea at the wrong time, but for whatever reason, it failed to find product market fit. And so we just, at some point, a year or two after it shipped, we said, this thing has failed, let's remove it. And the use counter was like 0. I was like, wow, yeah, the use counter 0. Yep, it failed, remove it. And so I think making things cheap to fail is key to enabling an iterative process of high quality standards engineering where we can get to interoperability and like full standards conformance from all the browser engines over time. Especially, I know in your other shows we've talked about investment asymmetry, right? Where's the money for investing in new web platform features, right? And if it's concentrated in one place or the other, you're gonna struggle. You can't do everything by consensus and kind of mutual investment.
Yeah, I mean, this is what I was getting at. I suppose I should have pointed to previous shows where we've mentioned that like Chrome, Google plays the role of the R&D arm currently of the web platform. So you do a lot of the research and development that other organizations can't afford to do, well, I want to say can't afford to. They probably could afford to, but don't invest in for whatever reason. And I'm not claiming there's a right or wrong answer to that question. But the way it is currently, the R&D of the web is largely done by Google, and it means a few things. Like one, it means that Google directs the R&D. So like maybe not everybody agrees with the particulars of the R&D that you're doing in some cases, or maybe there is this asymmetry where you can't afford to pay attention, and so you feel dragged along a little bit sometimes. And yeah, so that is what I was getting at. I was saying, like, I think this thing about this forcing function is, I think about standards as sort of like degrees of real.
Mm-hmm.
And I look for signals along the way to say, like, hey, this thing just got more real. I mean, we have this product that we make, BCD Watch, that like you can go to bcd-watch.igalia.com and you can see there's an implementation report, and it will tell you every week, tiny little report that is like, these are the things that got recorded as being implemented in a third engine. So it's like a super tiny list, and you can just open your RSS reader every week and you can be like, okay, it's those 5 things. And it's like really easy to keep up if you want to know what things as a web developer you should probably, like, you can safely learn about, because they're not going to be radical changes. There's not questions about whether these are going to ship. Like, they're in all the engines. They might not be shipped everywhere yet. They might not be available. That's what baseline and all that is for. But this is a signal that give you a nice heads up. So I look for those, and I look for the forcing functions, like I said, that the rest of us can watch. And I don't know if there's like some opportunities here to maybe improve that so that we have easier to follow signals, so that people know when it's like, hey, this is ready for, in standards, we would kind of call this wide review. But, I think that the public version of that is just like, hey, we're going to do this if anybody cares, whether that's privacy people or security or accessibility or just JavaScript developers, whatever. You're going to get the feedback if people start to look at it. So, how do we raise good signals? I think there used to be a Twitter bot that was like intent Twitter bots. Did Google run those? Do you know?
No, I think it's just a community run thing, just off of our mailing list. It's just mining the Blink Dev mailing list is where these go. So there's multiple people have built different tools that mine the Blink Dev mailing list.
Yeah.
But I mean, part of the challenge here is you got to ask, like, what's the right time to do what level of review? Right. And, we have this even with tag review, right? We've got early tag review and then full design reviews. And, in a lot of cases we hear from tag, in some cases, if this feature only has interest from one browser vendor at the moment, maybe it's too early for tag review. It's not a good use of tag's time to look at it if there's only one browser vendor really interested in this feature, right? And I think that's part of the crux in this. I don't think there's any one perfect answer to that question. What's the right time to review this? I think of it more as expanding circles, right? You want to start with, there's maybe a small group of people who are, and I'm not saying that should be constrained in some way, but I'm saying, new ideas, it doesn't make sense to have 10,000 people reviewing them, right? Have like one web developer who's going to be using this feature, have one browser vendor, right? Maybe have one accessibility expert, something like that. And then you want to widen the circle of reviews more and more over time. And, by the time something gets to a rec class standard, it should have had very wide review. But of course, there's always this challenge of the earlier something is, the easier it is to change it. Right. So
Yeah,
I don't know.
I like the circles. We've called that like layers of an onion.
Yeah.
So I like to
yeah.
say like standards have layers, like an ochre.
Yeah.
Or an onion.
Yeah.
When you cut right through them, you cry. Anyway.
Yeah. But I do think, your point about forcing function is, I think a lot of this is about creating the structures such that we tend to get a good outcome by design instead of by requiring some kind of heroics, right? If you think back to the way we used to do web API design, even with standards process, it took a lot of heroics to get to a good outcome, to get to interoperability, to get to, something that actually solved, didn't have accessibility problems, didn't have privacy and security problems and whatnot. So I absolutely agree with you. A lot of, in the perfect world, this whole process we have, where with Chromium, where we have API owners, sometimes people think about it as, oh, the API owners are like these expert, judges. In my perfect world, the API owner is just a script, right? Like, it's just like a checklist. Like, do we actually have the culture and the engineering discipline and the processes such that everyone involved in shipping a new API knows how to do a good job of standards and web platform tests and tag review and whatnot. And you just need to make sure that all the boxes got ticked or something like that. And to me, it's more, and we've seen this happen with web platform tests, for example, right? When we started and we said, hey, if you want to ship, we started by saying, if you want to ship a new feature in Chromium, you need to either point to web platform test or explain why that's not easy. And we got a lot of pushback from that. And a lot of people said, well, it's not easy here and it's not easy here. And, I funded a team at that point to go and hammer down all those, somebody said it's not easy here, go invest and make it easy. So that next time there's no excuse. And a lot of that, we shifted our culture such that now it's just the expectation that anytime you ship something new, of course it comes with web platform tests. You're going to probably write those near the start instead of as some, I remember back in the day, sometimes we'd hire some vendor to go after the fact when everybody was already done and everything, all the work was done. It's like, oh crap, we forgot to check the performance test suite. Let's go find some, low-cost vendor somewhere who can whip out some performance tests for us. But the only way we've been able to do things like the interop program and whatnot is like we've really ingrained that. We've used it as a forcing function to ingrain it into our culture that writing conformance tests is as important as writing specifications in how we engineer the web now.
Honestly, more important in my opinion. But
thank you. I agree. I didn't want to go that far, but I agree with you. I think they're more important than specifications.
Yeah.
One thing that I wanted to ask about, if just this past week, Sarah Tudan wrote a thing about the CSS carousels, which is the thing that we talked about that led to some of these conversations. And this week on the Shop Talk show, they were also talking about, primarily that article and the things around it. And, they asked, how does a thing ship if it has issues? And I was just wondering, like, if you want to respond to that.
Yeah, I don't know the details of Carousel. I know there's been some debates about some aspects of it. But in general, I would say from an engineering perspective, everything has issues of some sort, right? And maybe it looks reckless. Hey, maybe it is. I think reasonable people can disagree about this. And I welcome constructive debate about this. And it's part of the reason why we have our intent to ship threads on a public mailing list that anyone can comment on, because we want to hear, contradictory perspectives on this. But if we acknowledge that everything has issues, the question then becomes, what are the issues that are easier to recover from and what are the issues that are harder to recover from? And some of that requires like a good understanding of what breaking changes are easy, what breaking changes are hard. Because a lot of the time we use shipping, just like we use ordering files to understand what's working and what isn't. Sometimes we ultimately need to fall back on shipping and saying, hey, there hasn't been a lot of engagement on this, or we think, now is the right time to get something out. And we think by doing that, we're going to learn something from it. My favorite example of this maybe is one I do know more about is the scroll to text feature, URL fragments, right? Where we extended the grammar of URLs to refer to text fragments. And that was controversial, right? This was one where we chose to ship it in Chrome. We were pretty convinced, we had evidence that it really brought value to users. And others felt like it wasn't ready yet. And So we shipped it, Edge turned it off in their browser based on Chromium, and other people looked at it, and eventually everyone else shipped it and said, actually, now that we've looked at it, it does look like it's probably okay. There's still some debate over it, but that's one where I think we were a little aggressive. And part of the reason we were aggressive is I was pretty comfortable saying, if we need to turn this off, we can. It's not like it's going to stop pages from working. This is a change that we can make where it's a two-way door. It's a reversible decision, right? So we got to be a lot more careful about the one-way doors. And we should be more comfortable taking risks when there's a two-way door that we know we can have confidence we can correct mistakes for in the future.
That makes sense.
Thanks, Rick, for coming on.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Really appreciate it. Always
thanks for having me, guys.
conversation. So
yeah,
remember, next guest, you get the free tote bag. You get the
awesome. All right.
All right.
Thank you, guys.